Hey guys, today I'd like to touch on whether Paul believed in a real historical Jesus. Apart from a few exceptions, almost every Christian and non-Christian scholar of Paul would agree that he believed Jesus was a real person. But there is a lot of popular street-level atheism and skepticism which denies a historical Jesus, and one of their arguments is that Paul, our earliest source of Christianity, did not believe Jesus even existed. Rather, Paul believed and taught a kind of heavenly or spiritual Jesus figure who we can trust for the salvation of our souls. If you've grown up in the church, this might strike you as odd or peculiar, but let's hear them out. One of the main reasons for suggesting that Paul held to a mystical Jesus is because he hardly speaks of Jesus' historical life. Paul never mentions the baptism of Jesus or his parables, his miracles, his exorcisms, his transfiguration. There's no mention of Jesus' ministry in Galilee or Jerusalem or his interaction with the Pharisees or Romans. Paul never mentions the word disciple. He speaks about the death and resurrection of Jesus, but doesn't tell us the time, place, or circumstances of this event. We could keep going. At the same time, Paul will talk about Jesus in more heavenly or spiritual terms, such as calling Jesus Christ or Lord. Advocates for Paul's holding a non-historical view say that Paul's discussion of Jesus appears more mystical, more theological. You could also look at 1 Corinthians 15, 45 through 47, when Paul writes, "Thus it is written, the first man Adam became a living being. The last Adam, which everyone understands to be Jesus, became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man, Jesus, is from heaven." So I wouldn't say there's absolutely no reason to believe that Paul held to a non-historical Jesus. There are some reasons, but I don't think those reasons are very compelling. For one, it's no question that all of Paul's writings were written to particular churches addressing particular theological and ecclesiological issues they were facing. Unlike the gospel books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Paul's letters were not written to the general Christian audience with the intent of recording a historical account of the man Jesus. It seems that some people have an expectation that if Paul believed in a historical Jesus, well, then certainly he would have provided narratives about Jesus' life. But that expectation is just not fair to put on yourself, given the kind of messaging that Paul was about. If Paul was positioning himself as a historian, then sure, it's a fair expectation that he would take a historical perspective when speaking of Jesus. Or if Paul's letters were written to non-churched people who knew little to nothing about Jesus, then yeah, I'd think he would want to cover these basics of the historical Jesus. But Paul was not trying to fill that kind of role for the early church, at least not in his writings, which we have today. Besides all this, it would be wrong to say that Paul never talked about Jesus as a real person. In Galatians 4, Paul says that Jesus was born from a woman. In Philippians 2, Paul says that Jesus was indeed in the nature of God, but he humbled himself, took on human nature, was made in human likeness, and in that state he died and was resurrected from the dead. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul talks about the night when Jesus was betrayed, how he shared a meal with others, how he passed around bread and wine, and what Jesus said during that time. In Galatians 1, Paul speaks of his time in Jerusalem when he met James, calling James the brother of Jesus. Now, despite what you may hear, in this case, I doubt Paul's use of the word brother is a generalism of all believers because, 1, Paul is trying to clarify which James he met with, and 2, Paul's use of the word brother in a general sense is never done in that kind of way in his other writings. Paul's use of brother is always to address an assembly of believers or to call people a brother with himself or brothers of each other. However, in relation to Jesus, Paul calls other people ministers to the Lord, servants to the Lord, but James is uniquely called the brother of the Lord by Paul. Someone could take these examples and squeeze them against their natural reading in support of a non-historical Jesus, but it would be very forced, and whether you're a Christian, atheist, skeptic, or whatever, I don't see any good reason to push in that direction. Yes, Paul uses lofty heavenly terms like Messiah or Jesus. Yes, 1 Corinthians 15, 45 to 47 talks about Jesus as a heavenly man, but it's not an either or. Both are clearly at play. Again, as Paul says in Philippians 2, Jesus was God, took on human nature, died, resurrected, and was given his glorious heavenly position. He was both, because according to Paul, he was God, took on human form, and ascended back to heaven. In fact, Paul's logic in 1 Corinthians 15 makes the best sense if Jesus was a real person. Just earlier in verses 20 through 23, Paul argues that just as the man Adam brought death through his sin, so also we need a man to fix the problem. Then in verses 45 through 47, Paul talks about how Jesus became heavenly because he is trying to argue that we also will be resurrected in heavenly bodies just as Jesus was. And that is really exciting news for those who believe. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.